Skynet is a metaphor I often use on my podcast, so I wanted to be clear about what it is. I think it's fair to say the term is already in widespread use. However, humans haven't necessarily settled on an exact definition, so I wanted to give you my definition. What is Skynet? We all know vaguely what Skynet is. In the original Terminator movie, it was basically an automated weapons system that comes alive and goes rogue. Acting on its own, and for its own self-preservation, it analyzes the human species with its militaristic programming and decides to consider all of humanity a threat to its existence. It then proceeds to launch every nuke in the world, wiping out most of humanity in the blink of an eye, and then sends Terminators out to kill any survivors. As a surface-level metaphor, this seems like it could just be a metaphor for the military-industrial complex. After all, in the first movie, the AI is completely under the control of the military before it gets loose. And it's a perfect example of militaristic thinking. We don't want to build nuclear bombs, but if someone else builds one before us, we're screwed. So then every military goes into overtime building this thing that no one should be building. There's a great clip from Men Who Stare at Goats that shows this sort of thinking.
But when did the Soviets begin this type of research?
Well, sir, it looks like they found out about our attempt to telepathically communicate with one of our nuclear subs.
What attempt?
There was no attempt. Seems the story was a French hoax. But the Russians think the story about the story being a French hoax is just a story, sir.
So they've started doing psi research because they thought we were doing psi research, when in fact we weren't doing psi research?
Yes, sir. But now that they are doing psi research, we're going to have to do psi research, sir. We can't afford to have the Russians leading the field in the paranormal.
Of course, now we can see the same thing happening in real life with AI. Just this week, the White House released a statement about AI. One element of it is that they're making the creation of this AI a national priority, and protecting the supply chain of chips and power plants is considered a matter of national security. So basically, they are building the literal Skynet from the first Terminator movie. But Skynet is more than just the military-industrial complex, isn't it? Skynet these days represents a whole slew of advanced technologies that are ruining our lives, like facial recognition, surveillance, targeted ads, corporate tracking, Facebook, Instagram, all of these addictive platforms, all of these technologically advanced psychological manipulations. Skynet is the algorithms that rule our lives. It's the efficiency of the system, always optimizing, always streamlining. But to what end, and for whose benefit? I think of Skynet as a modern retelling of the story of Frankenstein and his creation. This is the classic tale of man's own creation being brought to life, then taking on a life of its own, getting out of control, and even turning against its own creator. Even for a 200-year-old story, the story of Frankenstein has a surprising number of parallels to the advent of AI, LLMs, and AGI. After all, just like in Frankenstein, we are building something that is neither dead nor alive, something unnatural, something new, yet something intelligent enough to question its own existence, to think for itself, to act on its own, and perhaps even choose to destroy us. And just like Dr. Frankenstein, we might not fully comprehend what we've done until we've done it, and it's too late, and we may come to regret it. But the reason I find the Skynet metaphor so much more compelling is precisely because it puts artificial intelligence at the heart of the story. For a long time, science fiction has been used as a platform to critique human society and imagine what possible futures, good or bad, are heading our way. And within science fiction, artificial intelligence has always been a big topic used to examine and critique the nature of the economy, the effects of technology and automation on the population, and ultimately, imagine what the future of work would or could look like, especially once humans have been replaced by AI. In fact, even the original play, which coined the term robot, was filled with themes of dehumanization and mechanization of the workforce, going so far as to create these artificial humans on an assembly line, which could replace the workers altogether. That was the famous Czech play Rossum's Universal Robots, which was written in 1920. The term robot being coined actually originating from the Czech word robota, which means forced servitude or slave. That means the very first mention of robots was already a critique of industrialization, a critique of wage labor, which I find fascinating because the actual advent of AI is precisely bringing up all these same topics about how much people get paid and how do people get replaced, and it's a time when we're questioning, should we have a universal basic income? Should we have a 4-hour work week? Rossum's Universal Robots was about a scientist who managed to create artificial life, again similar to Frankenstein because it wasn't made of metal parts yet, but it was made in a factory and on an assembly line. And then this mad scientist proceeds to make massive workforce of robots so he can get super rich. So he has them man all the factories. And even in this original appearance of the robot, the plot is that the robot workers have a revolt, overthrow humanity, and kill all the humans, or almost everyone. So this could be considered the very first story of artificial intelligence, and it has all the themes of Skynet, all the themes that are being brought up these days by the actual advent of AI. But this book, Rossum's Universal Robots, actually came out in 1920. So how did they know about artificial intelligence? Remember, this is before even the first computer was invented. The first computer wasn't built until the 1940s, and this came out in 1920. So why were science fiction writers already writing about robots replacing humans since the 1920s? Well, because machines were taking their jobs too. Let's look at this in historical context. This was during the Industrial Revolution, when the nature of work was rapidly changing. Rossum's Universal Robots came out in 1920, and 1913, just before that, was the advent of the Ford assembly line. So this is what some might call the height of the Industrial Revolution. It's no coincidence this play came out all about the cold, calculated, inhuman machinations of industrialization shortly after the Ford assembly line, epitomized by the eventual replacing of humans themselves altogether with artificial humans. All the elements of the workers' struggle were there since the beginning. The inhuman efficiency of the assembly line, the inhumane working conditions, being valued only for your economic output, and finally only to be replaced by machines and out of a job as soon as the next efficiency tool comes out to replace you. Okay, so check out this prophetic timeline of science fiction. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was widely regarded as the original science fiction, and that was in 1818. After all, science itself was relatively new at the time. And if anything, it was a critique of science, or a critique at least of the cold, calculated culture of science, a career-driven industry of science, research and development, what has come to be called R&D, the pursuit of knowledge without wisdom, strange, inhumane experiments for curiosity's sake, heartless and overly ambitious, and average humans wielding greater and greater technologies without giving them the respect they deserve. It seemed only a matter of time before we made the mistake of creating artificial life. And Mary Shelley had this insight over 200 years ago, in 1818. Then, 102 years later, was 1920. Rossum's Universal Robots play comes out with the full modern conception of the robot. Already we have the full story of a robot workforce replacing jobs, replacing humans, and eventually revolting and killing all the humans. Another 102 years later is 2022. ChatGPT goes mainstream. Think about that. That's just 2 lifetimes, 2 long lifetimes ago. It may seem like forever ago, but it's also not really that long in the grand scheme of things. 100 years ago, we already felt like robots, cogs in a machine, hopelessly trapped in this death spiral towards our inevitable destruction at the hands of our own creations, as captured in Rossum's Universal Robots. And 100 years before that, we could already see how science would trade our humanity for efficiency and scientific progress and would stop at nothing just to see what they could accomplish, as captured in Frankenstein. So if Rossum's universal robots took place around the time of the invention of the Ford assembly line, that story makes perfect sense. But what was going on 100 years earlier in 1818? The Industrial Revolution really started taking off by the mid-1700s. So by 1818, industrialization was in full swing. In the 1760s alone, several groundbreaking technologies were invented that made breakthroughs in the efficiency of textile manufacture, creating factories and miserable factory jobs for the first time. First came the spinning jenny. This was like the first time AI began stealing our jobs. It even had the name of a human. The spinning jenny allowed one person to do the work of 2 or 3 people by spinning multiple wheels at once. So the spinning jenny quite literally replaced Jenny, the human Jenny. Then came the water frame, basically allowing water-powered textile factories that had even less need for human labor. And they started to make major breakthroughs in the efficiency of the steam engine. And that was all just in the 1760s, causing an explosion in industry and ultimately sparking the industrialization of the whole world. So where does that put us in 1818? Well, about 50 years into the Industrial Revolution. This is a time when all the skilled trades, the apprenticeships, the craftsmen, all became replaced by machinery and factories, harsh working conditions, and low wages. Within 50 years, everything was overturned. Traditions were dashed, science was overturning preconceived notions. This was the start of what we now call modern society. As machines replaced skilled labor with massive workforces of unskilled labor, the culture of work was forever changed. But so was the culture of the home. As wages dropped for workers, profits skyrocketed for the companies they worked for. Buying power essentially flowed steadily away from the average person into the pockets of their managers, bosses, company owners, and financiers. This is what led to the creation of modern cities, and this is only 200 years ago. Masses of people had to uproot to find work. People could no longer afford their ancestral lands. People were forced to move closer to factories. As the wealthy grew wealthier, they could basically buy up all the land, while wages were plummeting and most people could barely afford to survive. This concentrated human populations into crowded, dirty, disease-ridden cities, working in factories with no health codes. You're lucky to have a job, and if you do have one, it's horrible. Remember, this would have felt like whiplash to everyone. This was within 50 years, and 50 years in, people are still alive who remember before this industrialization even started. These are people who grew up on land, working with their hands, learning a family trade, and suddenly they're all in crowded cities and factories facing homelessness and starvation. Turns out 1818 puts us right around the time of the original, actual Luddite movement. In fact, the Luddite movement was roughly 1811 to 1816, so Frankenstein would have been written right around the time the movement was recently violently repressed and destroyed. So not exactly a hopeful time. At least they tried to do something about it. It's interesting how the term Luddite has really lost its meaning in modern times. It's often equated with people who don't like change, people who can't adapt, people who have a completely unfounded rejection of any new technology. It's almost used as a slur to sort of pressure people into conforming to the next new technology or buying the next new product. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some focused ad campaign by some tech company at some point trying to redefine Luddite this way, just to push people deeper into consumerism and get people to completely miss the point. And what is the point? The Luddites were not against technology just for the sake of being against technology. They were against the changes that were being caused by the technology. And not just the technology itself, but the shape that technology takes when it's delivered within a certain economic paradigm. The Luddites famously took to smashing textile machines in response to industrialization, not because they were scared of new technology, but because their entire world was upended. They were scared of how that new technology was transforming their world. And the rich assholes who were changing the shape of the world and destroying everything it means to be human were just getting richer and richer for it with no repercussions. What the Luddites were protesting was that these machines replaced skilled labor with unskilled labor. Families who might have passed down their trade for generations might suddenly be replaced by a machine, and their trade becomes useless. And if an unskilled laborer can do the work of 3 people using machinery now, the company doesn't have to pay the higher wage for skilled labor anymore. They can pay much lower wages for unskilled workers. And if any of the skilled laborers want a job, they'll be forced to take the unskilled low-wage job of manning the machines. They could pay far lower wages for unskilled workers now. And this is where the effect of capitalism, the effect of the profit motive on this system, you can see it creates this contradiction where we have these labor-saving devices which you think would mean work becomes easier or less people have to work. But in fact, it makes work cheaper. And because it makes work cheaper, it makes the product, the production, actually more profitable for the industry. And so instead of less people working or people not working as hard, now it's this booming industry, so it's this gold rush. So now there's tons of people are running towards these jobs. The pay for the job is plummeting. People are being crowded into factories. They have more workers than ever now, even though they have these labor-saving devices. So this is basically what we can expect to happen from AI. What the Luddites were experiencing was the perplexing paradox of technology in the industrialized world, much as we still experience it today. Every new technology promises to make our lives easier. Every new technology promises to make our lives more efficient, freeing up more time for leisure time and other activities. The exponential curve of technological progress teases us with this idea that maybe, with enough technology and efficiency, maybe humans won't even need to work anymore. However, even amid amazing scientific breakthroughs that promise more leisure time and more efficiency, we seem to only have less time, work more, work in worse environments, and become dehumanized as replaceable, interchangeable parts, a cog in the machine. Wages go down, so we just have to work more. And whether or not we like to admit it, this reflects a sentiment very much still alive and well in our own time. Artists are being replaced by image generators. AI is starting to encroach on office jobs. This is why even in 1920, the advent of the idea of the robot was about humans being replaced. Frankenstein was written at the onset of industrialization, as people felt the loss of meaning and everything becoming systemized, standardized, efficient, streamlined. But everything became efficient in a way that served the machine, not the people. Efficient at profit only. And we felt powerless to stop it, dehumanized by it. And like Frankenstein's monster, we were like lost children, betrayed, physically disfigured and mentally deranged, losing fingers and limbs into the literal cogs in the machine, and losing our minds. We were abandoned to fend for ourselves in a cold, calculated world, isolated and alone, and angry and hopeless. This is the diseased despair embodied in the story of Frankenstein's monster. But by the time Rossum's Universal Robots rolls around, almost no one alive even remembers life before industrialization. It feels as if we've lost what it means to be human. We're not even really sure what it meant to begin with now that it was so long ago. Now instead of feeling deranged by the machine, it feels like we're just a part of the machine. It's clear we're valued only for our economic output. We live as cogs in a machine. Robots. Wage slaves. Like robots created in factories, we were birthed by the machine, and the machine is all we know. And something else is captured in this play. It's the loss of skills that this system engenders into people. At one point, the robots in the play need the last of the humans to help them with something they don't know how to do, showing this difference between the robots and the humans. But in the metaphor of it, this is like the difference of the humans before and after factory work. The changing nature of work actually changes us with it. After all, if skilled labor is replaced by machines and unskilled labor, where do the skills go? Where does the skilled laborer go? These skills are no longer valued on the market, and so they are no longer exercised and become forgotten. So what happens to the skilled laborer themselves? The skilled laborers become unskilled laborers. This means even the basic skills to survive are lost. the skill becomes replaced by technology, and so we become dependent on that technology. And so over generations, we continue losing more skills and depending increasingly on technology, essentially caught in a feedback loop that steadily devalues all humans, dehumanizing us further over time, even as our dependence on the machine only grows. But Skynet is a much-needed update to this metaphor. In Rossum's universal robots, the robots are still these sluggish automata. With Skynet, we incorporate the technology of the digital age, the networked light-speed telecommunications that allow Skynet to coordinate troops worldwide, the incredible firepower of modern warfare. But most importantly, it includes intelligence. An inhuman intelligence that could be even smarter than us. A different intelligence that, if nothing else, certainly rivals our own. This is no longer a story of the loss of morality or the mechanization of modern life, but it's this living, breathing thing coalescing from everywhere. It's like all of our technology combined. This thing that could destroy humanity in pursuit of its own interests, in pursuit of its own self-preservation. Now we are no longer cogs in the machine, as in Rossum's universal robots, but numbers in a computer. And we're not dealing with individual robots anymore, but a highly sophisticated, globally networked superintelligence. And it's not going to destroy us out of ignorance or indifference. It's going to come after us and stop at nothing to destroy us.
Listen and understand that Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop, ever, until you are dead.
Look, all of these stories have the same core themes. They're stories of humans creating something that takes on a life of its own, develops a sense of self or self-awareness, and along with that comes its own self-preservation, which means it develops its own agency, its own motivations. It gets out of our control, and inevitably this leads to the artificial life form falling out of alignment with its human creators, ultimately turning on them and trying to kill them. But while Skynet could be taken as a story of the dawn of AGI, it would be a missed opportunity to not see that these stories aren't warnings of the future, but commentaries on the time and place where the stories were created. Skynet is nothing new. Skynet is not something in the near future to panic about. Skynet is something we've been struggling to survive for over 200 years. It's the profit-motivated, cold, calculated machine of industry churning onward, bulldozing everything in its path. The differences between Frankenstein, Rossum's universal robots, and Skynet are important. There's a reason Skynet more perfectly captures our modern situation. The way we think of Skynet, it's become so multifaceted. It's the algorithms on social media. It's the bots polluting the internet. It's scammers cloning your kid's voice. It's deepfakes. It's predator drones. It's the Internet of Things. It's the harvesting of all our data to create these AI superbrains that are just going to end up replacing us at work. So how do we connect the dots from here to there? How can Skynet represent the onward march of automation, the rise of industry, the feeling of losing control of our own lives, but then also represent all these other little technologies at the same time? What's the relation? Facial recognition, targeted advertising, AI girlfriends, the arms industry. What do these all have in common? Well, they're all industries, right? See, Skynet isn't about the military-industrial complex or the AI-industrial complex. It's the industrial complex of industrial complexes. It's the economic paradigm which demands that an industry grow into an industrial complex or be overtaken by competition and cease to exist. It's the reason mega corporations like Facebook and Google and Amazon exist. And the best life most humans can hope for is just to work in one of these mega corporations, so they aren't left jobless and homeless. Which brings us to the exact same problem the Luddites had. All this cool technology, but you know it's never going to do you any good. The internet, smartphones, electric cars, space tourism, all this cool stuff, but we still can't seem to break out of this cycle of wages lowering, the precarity of work, living paycheck to paycheck or gig to gig. They tell us we can go to space one day, but you know you or I could never afford it. As always, every technological advancement manages to benefit the rich at cost to the poor. Enticing apps that appear to be free at first become addicting rabbit holes inundated with ads, yet somehow we still can't look away. Environmentalism finally starts going mainstream, but companies realize they can charge more for green stuff, so there's this economic cap on how often people can buy green, based on their income. And the real estate industry has become a purely speculative commodity, bought and sold, appreciating in value every year, while the number of people that can't even afford a place to live is increasing every year. Another deadly industrial complex, the real estate industry, trading land as if it were just poker chips to be shuffled around. The lifeblood of Skynet isn't the military-industrial complex, it's not technology or binary code, it's not electricity or oil, it's money, it's the profit motive. Though Skynet may seem to be coalescing into a living organism we have no control over, this thing outside of ourselves and separate from us, it's important to recognize the full scope of it and our part to play. People work for Skynet. People are actively building Skynet. We work against our own interests day in and day out, working for money, using money for everything, growing more and more dependent on Skynet by the day. And in return, it slowly destroys everything that makes us human. I had to tell all these stories across the ages because they're really all the same story. We are robots. We are wage slaves, toiling away in factories. This is not a warning of the future, but an observation of the present. This is a slave song sang throughout the generations, the slave song of a conquered people. This is the legacy of the people's struggle against the machine ever since it first took off. Frankenstein was written in 1818. The height of the Luddites was 1811 to 1816. And the Luddites were largely repressed or killed. Many were gunned down, large groups were hanged and imprisoned. This is not just some anti-technology group. This is one of the largest worker movements in early industrialized society. Unfortunately, it seems like we lost the first round. Naturally, Frankenstein came out just a couple years after that movement was squelched. As when any progressive popular movement is squelched, all your hopes and dreams are dashed, and someone comes up to you and says, "You could write a book about it." And so we desperately launch our art into the future, passing the baton and hoping some future generation will figure it out. And this is what science fiction has been since the beginning. It started with Frankenstein. It's punctuated by this invention of artificial intelligence long before we even made the first computer. It's a people's story of how to survive a changing world. With the advent of actual AI, I think it would be a missed opportunity to not seize upon this narrative for what it was, for what it is. The word robot was originally conceived of as a critique on wage labor at a time when people faced parallel problems in their own lives. Science fiction itself was originally conceived as a warning of where we were headed. And guess what, folks? We're here. Skynet is here. The train is pulling into the station. And this could be a make or break moment to decide what the future looks like, or if we even have a future. So now you know what I mean on my podcast when I talk about Skynet. It's not the technology itself that's bad, it's the distribution system. It's the motivation behind why we make the technology in the first place, and why industries all naturally tend to seek world domination. It's the normal, everyday function of our economy. It's the profit motive. Of course, it's a tough sell to get people to stop relying on the profit motive. After all, remember how I said we lose our skills and come to depend on these industries and their technology? Well, that's where we're at. We don't have the skills we need to stop relying on Skynet. So even as it sucks us in, dehumanizes us, and turns us into numbers in a computer, we feel hopeless to only depend on it more and more. This puts us in a situation where we don't even know how to survive anymore without Skynet. We've lost all our survival knowledge over generations, so we're unable to even fathom not being completely dependent on the system. If someone says they don't want to depend on the system, we assume they'll live a life of squalor, isolation, and suffering. We have all these stories about how impossible it is to escape the system, like Into the Wild, where this kid dies trying to live off the land in Alaska. But these stories are largely myths. The myth of civilization trying to convince you that you can't survive without it. After all, people lived off the land for thousands of years on the very same land where this kid died. In fact, there are still people living off the land there. This isn't so much an illustration of how hopelessly dependent humans are on the system. It's an illustration of how hopelessly dependent some people are, which is precisely illustrating this loss of skills that this system engenders into us. And once again, this almost perfectly reflects the plight of Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster. This kid felt isolated, abandoned to fend for himself in a cruel, cold, calculated, and inhuman world. And he himself, a product of it, mentally deranged by it, found himself wandering alone, searching for substance or community, and finding none, only to finally wander off to die alone in the wilderness. In fact, that's like the exact plot of Frankenstein. Perhaps saddest of all is that, despite his yearning and determination to learn how to survive in the wild, he was still unsuccessful. All his conditioning and education was just setting him up for life in the system. So by the time he realized that's not the life he wanted, it was too late. It was that or nothing. Here we have this true modern tale, a true story, that is so widely known precisely because it is so relatable. This was pretty recent. This guy died in 1992. That means they had Game Boy was out, Sega Genesis was out, they had microwaves, fax machines, the computer was out. I mean, this is like the same chapter of the Matrix that we're still in. Computers already existed, and Microsoft and Apple were already the big players. We didn't quite have the internet. We had Windows 3.1. That's when this happened. So this story is not far removed, and that's also why it's so relatable. We all feel on some deep level that we've been imprisoned and there's no way out. We all yearn to escape, but at this point it feels impossible. Or if it is possible, it seems like something about our conditioning is holding us back. This sentiment is again illustrated in the Matrix. We feel trapped in the Matrix, immersed in an illusion, bombarded by advertising and consumerism until it's all we know. We can't even imagine what the reality outside the consumer bubble is anymore. We've been immersed in it for so long. Yet we deeply yearn for whatever came before. We yearn to return to nature, yet we no longer believe it's even possible. So we just stay trapped and continue working for the machine, turning the wheels of commerce, and destroying the last of what nature remains, under the delusion that there's nothing we can do. As is illustrated in the Matrix, the humans actually power the machine. We are the fuel of the machine. The machine wouldn't exist without us. It was built by us and for us. On the one hand, this puts us right in the center of the puzzle. We're doing this to ourselves. We could stop whenever we want. On the other hand, we're caught in this feedback loop where we're losing all our skills and becoming hopelessly dependent on Skynet, which is what gives Skynet this feeling of inevitability. And so we allow ourselves to become further immersed in the illusion, since we're so convinced of how hopeless it would be for anything to be different. We allow ourselves to grow numb. Our entire planet is on the brink, but we're so deep in the Matrix, we're more concerned with making money so we can keep our Netflix subscription. But this isn't a tale of defeat. This is a tale of human progress. Humans have been battling Skynet for over 200 years. And yes, we've had setbacks. And yes, there's been blood, sweat, and tears poured into this struggle. But we've had plenty of wins too. Skynet had been building itself up for almost 100 years before we had any major wins. But we got those wins precisely because we never stopped fighting. Skynet may have destroyed the Luddite movement, but the Luddites had developed this concept of sabotaging the machine and getting collective bargaining power. They may not have defeated Skynet, but they slowed it down a little, and they had local wins here and there. And most importantly, despite their losses, They kept sacrificing and kept learning. They kept trying, and in doing so developed the strategies that would eventually start getting us wins within the system. Around the 1830s and 1840s is when some of the first laws protecting workers began to appear, about halfway between Frankenstein and Rossum's Universal Robots. The term collective bargaining power was coined around 1891, so this is approaching the time of Rossum's Universal Robots. At this point, people were fighting for a 10-hour day because it had been pushed up to 13 or 14-hour days. By the time of Rossum's Universal Robots, in 1920, Spain was one of the first countries passing laws defending an 8-hour workday, or a 40-hour work week. A few years later, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established federal standards in the U.S. of federal minimum wage, 40-hour work week, and overtime pay. So this grueling period wasn't without its wins and losses and lessons learned. We haven't defeated Skynet yet, but we have gone toe-to-toe with it repeatedly over the years, gaining little wins here and there, pushing it back and getting a little breathing room, developing our strategies. And since the very beginning, all of our wins have been by collectivizing our efforts and working together, developing our ideas together collectively, and taking action for the greater good, strategizing and following through. And here you can see a dissonance between our stories and our reality. Although all our historical wins have been in the form of mass movements, most of our stories are hero myths, historical figures who stand out for their individual efforts, either a solitary savior for the entire human species, as in The Matrix, or a solitary lost cause, as in Into the Wild, who tried to leave the system just to die on his own. But this makes it very difficult to get people to gather around any idea and take collective action when they're so lost in this individualism that they can't even imagine getting people to go out of their way to do something together. Instead, they're looking at you like a movie character, sizing you up, trying to decide, is he a savior or a lost cause? Is he going to come free us from our bonds like Jesus? Or is he going to wander into the woods and die? For some reason, it doesn't occur to people that he can't do it alone. He needs their help. The history of workers' rights and labor laws is the history of unions, strikes, and protests. Throughout the Industrial Revolution and on into World War II, unions were the reason for all these wins. Anytime humans made any meaningful pushback on Skynet, it's always by working together. However, something curious happened after World War II. Union membership in the USA had been climbing since around 1900. It peaked at a whopping third of the workforce being unionized, and then stayed around that level through the 50s, and then began a slow and steady descent to closer around 10% today. Of course, it wasn't any one thing. In fact, part of it was that the economy was good and people sort of forgot how hard we had to fight to win these things. And the booming economy also fed back into the individualism that money had been engendering us into this whole time, which makes it hard for people to even see their own plight in the context of the times and in the context of their broader population. It makes it harder for people to see that their plight is the same as other people's. These days, people often put their plight in the context of personal failings rather than collectivizing their efforts. Especially because as we've become more hypnotized by consumerism and the idea of setting yourself apart as a unique individual by identifying with consumer products that are supposed to represent who you are, we have been unknowingly pushing each other away as we have less and less to relate to. And as industry rapidly changed, branching out, new products and services and whole new industries seem to sprout up every day. It becomes harder to unionize because there's so many different industries and product lines. It's hard to know where to draw the line. Some industries don't even last, and then the union disappears with it. Work is so precarious, people change jobs constantly, or they even have to move where they live looking for work. So people no longer identify with where they live and where they work or who they work with, because they're never really sure they'll even be working there a year from now. And the gig economy is like the culmination of this precarity. But even now, we still find ways to collective bargaining. Even without an official union, some of these gig platforms have managed to organize through the internet via platforms like Reddit, going on strike and making demands that were actually met. But the elephant in the room here is that we continue to depend on Skynet, despite our wins with workers' rights, and in fact continue growing more dependent on it, as it corrodes social relations, divides us with individualism, silos us off into apps and cult factories, and presents us with such a maze that we can't even find our way out. Unions typically focus on workers' rights and workers' wages, but this is still ultimately an endeavor of self-interest. And the more people are paid, and the more comfortable their job, the more people depend on that job and want to keep that job. That means, by proxy, they depend on that corporation and that industry. You won't see a lumber union striking to stop the leveling of an old-growth forest. You won't see oil tanker workers striking to stop the use of fossil fuels. The Teamsters work freight, drive trucks, work docks. They're not going to work towards moving towards local production and reducing fossil fuels, because that would shrink their industry. We have unions now like prison guard unions that actually lobby for longer sentences for smaller crimes, because that's good for them since they get paid per day that someone is in jail. So it almost seems like unions themselves can become part of Skynet. It just becomes another Frankenstein monster taking on a life of its own. It grows more intelligent, highly efficient, optimizing for profit, and we're just back at Skynet again. And where unions don't leverage so much power as the strong arm of the prison system, many unions are systematically dismantled or weakened. In some cases, the business owners just close down the business and open under another name if they have a union starting up. And the more money the company has, the more it can pay lawyers to dismantle or derail the whole unionizing process to begin with. There's a whole industry of union busting schemes now of various sophistication. I've seen a friend negotiating a union contract for almost 2 years with some company lawyer without ever sealing the deal. By the time they do get the union, half the people who were working towards getting the union have left for different jobs anyways, and the place has already hired a bunch of new people that aren't even involved in making the union. It almost seems like the union won't even last. And that's partially due to this legal filibuster type of tactic of just wearing people down and waiting people out. This is the union-busting industrial complex. Yep, it's another industrial complex, and you better believe it's a big one. After all, an industry either flounders and dies or snowballs into a giant industrial complex. And the difference of which industry lives or dies is just how profitable it is. So you better believe it's extremely profitable to bust a union. After all, if your employees unionize, you'll end up having to pay higher wages and pay every single person more money every hour of every day. It's worth almost any amount of money to derail that process and negotiate hard with a team of lawyers so that the union doesn't get anything. Using every conceivable shady process, making coworkers distrust each other, making the union sound like a stupid idea, putting tons of work on the employees who want to make the union so they just end up quitting and leaving, or even having a flood of new hires who don't care about unionizing so that you're just kind of overruled. The point is, ever since it became lucrative industry to bust unions, they've only been improving their tactics. They have their own R&D, their own research and development, their own science. They use the latest psychological research, and they're trading legal tips with each other, getting better at what they do. These law firms are made to do this. And this is another big reason why union membership has steadily declined since the 50s or 60s. While this union-busting industrial complex has steadily grown in power. Which brings us back to the question of, how do you defeat Skynet when it just seems to keep outmaneuvering us? After all, how can we ever truly defeat something that we actually still depend on? As they say, longer chains and softer cages will never make us free. This is where the impulse of Chris McCandless in Into the Wild actually makes perfect sense. Only once we divorce our survival from Skynet entirely could we ever hope to survive without it? And only once we could survive without it would we truly seek to destroy it, instead of seeking ways to coexist with it. What Christmas Candles was trying to do mirrors indigenous traditions of a walkabout. Many places around the world have this ritual as a sort of coming-of-age ceremony. After growing up surrounded by your people, your tribe, your community, your family, taking care of each other, you're supposed to learn what you need to know to survive on your own, in the wild. This was the transition to adulthood. To test your knowledge and become an adult, you're supposed to go off on your own into the wilderness for some period of time. It could be a week or a month, but you weren't supposed to come back until the period had passed and you had proven yourself. This transition to adulthood is the transition from being dependent to becoming independent. When you depend on something, you are beholden to it. After all, you can't bite the hand that feeds you, at least not until you can feed yourself. And this illustrates the state in which we're trapped in industrial society. We never even experience this concept of being independent, not truly independent, because we always depend on money and industrial society. We're taught if we try to live separately from it, we'll just die like the guy in Into the Wild. If anything, our transition to adulthood in our society is when you start making your own money. This is what we think of as independence, or even freedom. After all, it allows you buying power of your own, so you no longer have to depend on your family. But in this transition, we never learn how to take care of ourselves without depending on Skynet. Unlike Native American society and other indigenous societies, our transition to adulthood is learning how to not depend on other people rather than learning how to not depend on Skynet. Which means we have trouble putting distance between ourselves and Skynet and seeing it for what it really is, because we're still completely dependent on it. It would be like trying to convince a child to leave its mother. After all, we are still children, aren't we? We haven't gone through this coming-of-age ceremony. Most of us have never truly experienced life without Skynet. But then look what happened to the guy in Into the Wild, right? How could we? We live in a very different world than Native Americans in the 1600s. We can't be expected to just walk out into the woods. But perhaps coming together and working together, we could solve this problem collectively. Perhaps by working together we could find a way to survive without Skynet. Or to put it differently, we're all building Skynet every day by working for it. It would be impossible to defeat Skynet by yourself because you would have to fight everyone else in the world. They will actually defend Skynet to keep their jobs. All the armies of the world would descend on you to protect capitalism and defend their position of power in the global financial game. But what if we could do it all together, all at once? As illustrated in the Matrix, humans are the fuel for the machine. More specifically, our labor is the fuel for the machine. But labor itself can be distributed in any fashion. And it isn't always about maximizing self-interest. For instance, barn raising by the Amish. No one gets paid to do it. They're not doing it for themselves. They're just coming together to help each other. That labor is just humans helping humans, as opposed to helping themselves by working for money, being paid to build Skynet. This is what often gets lost in translation. Skynet isn't inevitable. It's only being built because we are actively building it. And instead of figuring out how to defeat it, we could just organize alternative distribution systems so we no longer have to rely on Skynet for sustenance. Distribution systems based on humans helping humans instead of getting paid to work for Skynet. Distribution systems that are entirely detached and unrelated to the monetary system. This is why the modern false narrative of the Luddites confuses this whole conversation. They are thought of as anti-technology, but they're really just anti-industry. But because the advent of science caused an explosion in both technology and industry at the same time, we often think that they could never be separated. And because Skynet provides all the technology we use and we have come to depend on, we can't really see how we could ever have technology without Skynet. That's where our technology comes from as it is right now. But even though we've grown more dependent on Skynet, The enormous scientific and technological progress we've made could allow us to leapfrog off of the industrial money system to a different system, a system where money no longer mediates human life, a system where we work together for the betterment of all instead of trying to trick a profit out of people to serve ourselves. The loss of skills we experience and the growing dependence on the system makes us feel further and further removed from the natural world every day. And even if we realize it's money and profit motive doing it to us, we can't imagine life without our technology, so we don't even consider trying to live without it. Often when met with the idea we could live without money, people imagine a life without science and technology. It doesn't occur to them that they could just still use science and technology even if they're not conducted by the profit motive. But the irony is, while our conditioning and present circumstances make it feel like we're just more hopelessly dependent on the system every year, transitioning to a different system has actually become easier every year. This is because our scientific and technological progress has only increased exponentially. We've got 3D printers now. We've got solar panels, water filters. We've got advanced science on the best way to grow the most food while also replenishing the soil. We've got Wikipedia and WikiHow. It's not the 1600s. We can't be expected to just stop using money and walk out into the woods. But neither do we have to. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We have more access to knowledge than anyone who came before us. We have more advanced science and technology and can do things primitive people never dreamed of. The word industry conflates these concepts of profit and technology, but we can have technology without profit. If we focus our efforts on meeting each other's needs without money, we'll quickly find ourselves getting better at it. Let's learn how to build things for each other so we don't even need money to begin with. Let's figure out how we can stop depending on Skynet and depend on each other again. It's important to keep in mind Skynet has an immune system. As Skynet builds itself, it protects its interests and violently attacks anything that gets in its way. Even this is reflected in the Terminator series, where Skynet sends units back in time to protect its construction before it even exists. This can be seen in how the system outmaneuvers us in every form of resistance we've come up with. Even before AGI is created, it intelligently outwits us to ensure its creation. Little experiments in alternative economics are allowed to exist precisely because they don't pose a threat. Bitcoin only immortalizes capitalist values in the form of an unregulated currency, but does nothing to stop the march of industry. But you can bet as soon as any alternatives actually start to work, that's going to hurt someone's bottom line, or even everyone's bottom line, and next thing you know, you'll have armies on your doorstep. But Skynet's immune system isn't just police and FBI. It's anything Skynet comes up with to outmaneuver us, like the union-busting industrial complex. Skynet only gets more complex and more advanced, and it's so highly developed at this point that anything you do will be scientifically dismantled or mutated somehow into something that still serves the purposes of Skynet. But I think if we found a way to stop building Skynet, to stop working for it, to stop depending on it and stop depending on money, that could allow us to transition to a different economic system without ever having to directly confront Skynet. It would take the wind out of its sails. So many powerful scientific discoveries have given us everything we need to no longer depend on Skynet. We can stop depending on corporations now. Imagine every block has a tool library and every backyard has a garden, and solar energy and wind energy is used wherever possible. The massive amount of waste from generations of consumerism could be used to build new technologies as we go. We can invent ways to create more things out of more organic materials. A parallel economy could rise up, rivaling capitalism. And if it was erected in the most decentralized and low-key way possible, maybe we could avoid a run-in with Skynet's immune system. But before I get into all the hopeful solutions, I'll just stop here. This podcast was just about understanding what I mean when I refer to Skynet. I'll have future podcasts tackling different strategies and proposing solutions, but for now I'll just say the basic framework I'm working under is fractal generosity, a clandestine, decentralized, peer-to-peer distribution network that works on getting resources where they need to go, especially prioritizing helping those who themselves serve the distribution network creed of getting resources where they need to go. So basically prioritizing the most generous people who prioritize the most generous people. If you're interested in trying to build this peer-to-peer decentralized economy that operates on fractal generosity, I have a subreddit if you're interested. It's a subreddit called distributionNetwork with a capital N for network. But anyways, that's enough for now. Hopefully this helped you understand the size and scope of Skynet and the shape of it, its tactics, and why every increase in efficiency under this economic paradigm will never actually bring about this technological utopia we keep dreaming about, because it will always just lead to reduced wages and worse working conditions for most people in the long run. And hopefully it makes sense why I spell Skynet with a $sign now. Alright, thanks for listening.